Hi, good afternoon. So welcome to my talk. I cannot see you, but I think you look great. It's very brave of you to come to the only talk in English. I hope you know it's in English. It's too late now, you can't leave. Okay, great. So thank you so much for coming to my talk today. Oh, why is it black? Sorry. Okay, is it on? Perhaps? Okay, great, cool. So thank you so much for coming to my talk today, Creating for the Unknown. Before we start, I have just two quick questions for you. So perhaps you can show me on a scale of 0 to 100, how optimistic do you feel about the next 10 years? Okay, honestly, not the worst I've seen, that's okay. Maybe the next question, still on the scale of 0 to 100, how much power do you think you have in shaping the next 10 years? Ooh, okay, a little less, but okay. Okay, great. Let's keep these questions in mind and let's revisit them at the end. So, hi, my name is Alicia. I am a senior service designer at the Lego Group. I am also external lecturer at the Köln International School of Design, as well as equally the Design Nantes Atlantique. I'm much more nervous saying that in front of real French people. And I am also the founder of Future Unfurled. But out of all of these titles, the one that I hold closest to my heart is that I am a futurist. So a futurist is someone that thinks, plays, prepares, and designs for the future. But I think it's actually not that hard to be a futurist. So if you're here today, you're probably a product owner, product leader, something to do with creating. And I will tell you that creating things is inherently about the future. Because anything that we create, not for this moment right now, is created for the future. So it's not so much that we should think about the future, but rather we have the responsibility to think about it. Because anything that we create, and once we put it out there, the impact that it has is out there forever. If you have created a chair, you can never undo the chair back into a living tree. Just like if you created an experience or an online platform, you can never change the way that the people have already experienced it. And so perhaps this is why H.G. Wells, who is considered the father of science fiction, he said that everything is fraught with consequence, yet it's only after something has hit us hard that we set about dealing with it. And he said this almost 100 years ago, but they still ring true today. And perhaps the best example of this is the plastic bag. So if you know anything about the story of the plastic bag, you'll find that it's really ironic to see the words, the sack of the future is here for you today, written on it. But if you look at the story of how it came about, the engineer who created this saw that at the time, people were using a lot of paper bags, and this caused a lot of deforestation. So he thought, wouldn't it be great if I can create something that's light, portable, reusable, so people can use this instead of cutting down trees? Of course, we now know that despite his best intentions, this has caused many more problems down the line. And this is not a unique situation to just the plastic bag. And this is why Peter Singer, who is a system philosopher, he said that many of today's problems come from yesterday's solutions. So in order to help us avoid the trap of the plastic bag and to do exactly this, I will say that we need to think about the future. So congratulations, I hereby knight you. You are also futurists. Now, as futurists, you get asked many questions, all sorts of questions. And the most common one I get is, oh, can you predict the future? Can you tell me what's going to happen the next 5 years? And I would love to tell you exactly what's going to happen, but I don't even have any investments. But I understand why people ask. Because when we think about the future often seems volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And all of these words are uncomfortable words for us to sit with. So for us, the humans, naturally we have this tendency of wanting to turn volatility into stability, uncertainty into certainty, complexity into simplicity, and ambiguity into clarity. But unfortunately, in this process, we lose a lot of nuances in the situations, and we kind of fall into this streamlined trap of thinking that there's a now, and then there's a future, and the future is certain, and that there's only one way towards it. But in reality, when we think about the future is more like shining a flashlight into the darkness. What is immediate and closer to us is the clearest, and what lies further ahead is an array of possibilities and many different paths to get there. So the point of thinking about the future has never been about predicting the future, because you can never predict the future correctly, but rather that we're using the future as a playground to think about what's not possible today, but could be possible tomorrow. So we can start preparing for all of those possibilities now. So how do we do this in practice? Every futurist have different approaches to the future. Today, I recommend we look at it through the lens of storytelling, speculative design, and system thinking. Because each of these schools of thoughts have a unique perspective into the future and reveals to us a truth of what the future will be. So I hope by the end of this session, you'll walk away with 3 new truths you've discovered about the future and 3 new tools to help you navigate the unknown. Okay, so let's start with storytelling. When we talk about the future, we have to ask, where does the future exist? And you'll find that this is a bit of a trick question, because the future doesn't exist, or rather the future doesn't exist yet. But just as cavemen told each other stories trying to make sense of the unknowns of the creation of the universe, we too can use stories to make sense of the unknowns of the future. When you're telling each other stories about where you see each other in the next 10 years, you're telling each other stories about the future. In fact, you find that we've been telling these stories for quite some time, from the hoverboards to mashed potatoes to a knife that can slice and toast at the same time. So why are these stories such a natural way for us to explore the future? Perhaps because it's the cheapest way to prototype, there's no cost involved, there's also absolutely no restraints, the only thing that limits you is your imagination, or perhaps it's a really good way of drawing people in by building empathy with them through stories. But there's also a deeper reason. Richard Slaughter, who is a prolific writer in the field of future studies, described the future as an essentially interior phenomena. This is because every experience we have with the future first starts internally in our imaginations. Then we find ways of communicating these thoughts out loud, and the most common form we take is through stories. We use stories because when we think about the future, we're not thinking about the future through logical units of measurements like time or KPIs or months. Instead, we imagine the future as a set of experience that is different to our experience today. So let's do a simple thought experiment. If the year is 2053, so now we're 50 years into the future, but every aspect of your life remains exactly the same. You wear the same clothes, you use the same phone, you take the same route to work. Would you still consider that as the future? Probably not, because we thought the future would have the hoverboards, the mashed potatoes, the knife that slices and toasts at the same time. And it is all of these things that is a contrast and different to our experience today that makes up our perception of the future. So in a way, when we talk about the future, it is kind of like the parable of the blind man and the elephant. None of us know what the future looks like, but we can all feel a little bit of what the future is to us. The one that touches the tail thinks the elephant looks like a rope. The one that touches the nose thinks the elephant looks like a bamboo. And so we don't know what the future looks like, but by telling each other these stories, we can try to paint the entire image of the future together. And sometimes we get it right. So Dr. Frankenstein used electricity to bring people back from the dead, much like a defibrillator would. In Star Trek, they had a replicator that's basically a 3D printer. And you'll find that Jedi has been using augmented reality in a galaxy far, far away for a really long time. And so just as stories contain multiple perspectives, we too can paint the entire image of the future through the exchange of these perspectives. And so as we do this, it means that we're exploring the future together through our collective imagination. And the future becomes more of a social dream, woven together by stories. It also means that when we take this approach, that we value a future where the individual's experience is just as valid as numbers, facts, and data. And so here I want to leave you with the first truth about the future, and that is the future is not bloodless. It doesn't mean that there will be blood or war, but rather that the future has a warmth and sentiment that's uniquely human because it started first within us. It is colored with our hopes, dreams, and emotions. And just as we cannot be without the world, the future cannot be without our experience of it. Okay, so this is nice in theory, but how does this apply to you? And how do we make this relevant? When we look at the future through the storytelling lens, it means that we're assuming the explorative angle, where we say that the future is not an automatic continuation of the past. Instead, we focus on all the things that could happen instead. But of course, this is easier said than done. Professor Muller, who is a professor at the Aarhus University, said that the biggest challenge when we talk about the future hides in the fact that we find it difficult to see the future as anything but extension of the present through the linear projection of what we know. So going back to thinking here's a now, here's a future, and that there's only one way towards it. So how do we break out of this way of thinking? I've been told that in every product presentation you have a 2x2, so here's mine. So you can imagine the future going in two directions, in the way that you desire and also in the way that you don't desire. Also that these changes can happen incrementally, very slowly, or radically, very fast. And from here, you can already quickly divide the future into 4 different scenarios. On the top left, we have the continuous growth, and this is the future that we're most familiar with. It's the one we talk about most, and sometimes the only one that we talk about. But I feel like there's just as much value in all of the other scenarios too. On the bottom right, we have the eventual collapse. This refers to a future where everything takes a turn for the worst. It keeps going in the direction that we don't want, perhaps due to environmental exhaustions or external factors that like wars or instabilities. On the top left, we have the complete transformation. The complete transformation. This refers to maybe a scientific or technological breakthrough that made what we thought was impossible today suddenly possible, and it transformed the way that we think about our everyday life, of which there are no return. And finally, on the bottom left, we have the dystopic survival. So this refers to a restrained future where we try to live with the uncertainties and maybe with the help of technology or innovation that we learn to live in a world where everything has taken a turn for the worst. Now, this tool is made for conversations so that you can take this to your stakeholders or to your team and ask, okay, so we know what the growth scenario looks like, but what does the collapse look like? What are changes that we will consider in the transformation realm? And what do we do if we enter the dystopic survival scenario? And once you're familiarized enough with these 2x2s, you can even disregard these labels I've given you and come up with your own scenarios. So an example of this is in 2019, during the pandemic, Arab really quickly released their own forecast for the future, and they divided the economic situation to 4 different scenarios, where their axis is on the scale of if the virus will get contained or if it will keep spreading, or on the horizontal scale if we enter recession or depression. So a not very optimistic view, but from this, they are also able to break out of this linear way of thinking that the future is certain and come up with these 4 different scenarios. More concretely, they can talk a little bit more of what does each of these scenarios look like, what will constitute these scenarios, and tangibly, how will these scenarios affect the different continents around the world. You can also use these scenarios in different ways. For example, what is the monetary impact for each of these scenarios? How many people does it affect? Or whatever other KPIs or things that you find relevant. But this is to help you to get accustomed to thinking that there's more than just one future, and the future can break out in many different ways. Okay, so up next is speculative design. Another question I get asked very often is, what is the point of thinking about the futures? Do you produce anything at the end? And this is a bit of a trick question, because when we look at the future through the lens of speculative design, it tells us that the point of thinking about the future is to open up space for conversations and debate, as defined by their creator, Dunn and Raby. In fact, when they tried to articulate what speculative design is and isn't, they came up with this AB manifesto. So if you're familiar with human-centered design or design thinking, you'll see a lot of sacrilegious thoughts being put on this chart right now, because it's telling us that in order to create for the future, it's not about solving problems, providing answers, or using design as a solution. It's not even about innovation or consumers or user-friendliness. Instead, creating for the future is about finding problems, asking questions, using design as a medium to provoke, to think about the citizens and ethics. And indeed, if you really think about it, why should we take a human-centered approach anyways? Humans is often just one actor in the complex problems that we face today, and we're limited by our own temporality of roughly 80 years. But the future will be there for everything. The weeds, the whales, the plastic bags, they all have and they all deserve their own future. So I would say that in order for us to think about the future, we have to imagine one where we as a species is decentered. So the idea of this human-centered design comes from a really old dualist thought called anthropocentrism. It's a remnant of a more religious time. And it is the idea that we consider human beings as the most significant entity in the entire world. So we interpret and regard the world in terms of human values and experiences only. But why should it be so? The future is fair. It will be there for everything. The weeds, the whales, the plastic bags, they all have and they all deserve their own future. And when we talk about equality now, we mean inclusivity, diversity, fighting back against discrimination, and these are no doubtingly important. But when we look at equality from a non-anthropocentric perspective, it means that everything, living or living, deserves a future equally. Perhaps this is why that we saw last year the US appointed their first diplomat for plants and animals, and in New Zealand, where I am from, that we've given the Whanganui River their own personhood. So if we go back to the point of speculative design, that it was to open up space for conversations and debates, I will argue that the first one we should have is to challenge the notion that the future is only ours. And so here is the second truth about the future, that is, the future is selfless. The future is not only about us, the humans, and we cannot center around our perspective alone. And instead, we have to register ourselves outside the constraints of our own human narrative to think about a way to bring equality to all things that deserves it. But how do we do this in practice? When we look at this from the speculative design lens, it means that we're assuming a normative angle, where we are dissatisfied with the current state of affairs, and instead we see the future as a possibility to fix all these things. Donna Raby said that it's now easier for us to imagine the end of the world than an alternative to capitalism. Yet alternatives are exactly what we need. We need to dream new dreams. So how do we dream new dreams? This is like asking you to think of a color that you've never seen before. And to do this, I think we need a new type of thinking called counterfactual thinking. Counterfactual thinking is exactly what it sounds like. You're thinking counter to the truth. And the easiest way of engaging counterfactual thinking is by asking, what if? Because the moment you ask a what-if question, it temporarily suspends any disbelief you have about the present and also about the future. And it instantly opens up your perspective into exploring all the different alternatives instead. For example, I can ask you, what if you turned blue for 24 hours after you lied? Or what if we imagined imagination as something vital to our health? Or what if we measure GDP in ways other than how much bigger it was last year? So by asking these what-if questions, you're temporarily disregarding any belief you have about the present and also about the future, and that you can explore more freely about the possibilities instead. An example of this is a project by Stuart Candy, who's a futurist alongside the Wales Commissioner of Future Generations. So fun fact, Wales have a commissioner for future generations. And they did this piece of design fiction item. So it was about the plot of land was going to undergo developments, and they wanted to send a letter to the citizens of the area about what will happen to the animals to that plot of land if it undergoes development from the perspective of the animals themselves. So you see here, there's every voice counts, and it pleads with the citizens about what will happen to their habitat. And all of this started from a simple what-if question of what if we can be more inclusive with our decision-making process? But of course, this counterfactual thinking is just like any other skills you have to practice and become better at. And this is quite difficult. So if you are interested in exploring more of this counterfactual thinking, this is a link to a public imagination toolkit. It has cards. It was developed by Stuart Candy, and it has cards and different templates to help you ask better what-if questions and be more explorative and curious about the future. Okay, so now we're on to system thinking. So it's no longer news that we now live in this sort of giant web of interconnectedness. The central bank adjusting its interest rate will eventually affect the cost of a latte. So where does the future sit on this web? And one way to think about it is that the future is change rippling through a system. The time and delay it takes for the change to reach us is the future that we anticipate. So in order to grasp the scale of these interconnectedness, we need to think bigger and further than just ourselves. And to do this, we often use system thinking. System thinking is characterized by holism and synthesis. And what that really means is that normally, when we want to understand something, we take this route of reductionism. So we try to understand what a thing is by breaking it down to smaller and smaller parts. So we would say that a car is something that has an engine, and it has a steering wheel, it has windows and a trunk and doors. So if something has all of these things, then this is a car. So we try to explain what it is by the product of the sums, and this is a process we call analysis. System thinking instead focuses on more of holism. It means that instead of breaking things down to smaller parts, we look at what the thing is through the relationship it has with others. So a car is something that drives on the road, that has a person sitting inside, that reads a traffic light signal. So we try to explain what a car is through the connection it has with others. So something else is driving on the road, it has a person, it reads the signals, then that is a car. And this process is called synthesis. And of course, to understand a problem, you need both kind of thinking, but system thinking focuses more on the latter. So now to demonstrate what system thinking looks like in action, you are going to be a little cotton farmer in a small exercise. So now you and the person next to you, you guys are now cotton farmers, your best buddies, and I'm going to show you a series of news flashes, and you have to decide if you're going to sell your cotton for higher or lower prices this season. Is that clear? Yeah? Okay, great. So find your cotton farmer buddy. And the first news is, Earth is experiencing a record high temperature for summer due to global warming. Many crops are affected. So take a moment to discuss, are you selling your cottons for higher or lower prices next season? Yeah, okay, so almost everyone said higher, great, but this is an easy one. So yes, it will increase in price because the production will decrease due to the crops being affected by the rising temperature, so we can't match the demands, resulting in higher prices. Okay, but then the next one. So the United Nations has created a new gene therapy targeting locusts in response to the current locust epidemic. Do you guys know what locusts are? It's like these little bugs that eat all the crops that comes in swarms. Yeah? Okay, cool. So the locust population is expected to be under control within 3 months, and further spreading of the epidemic is prevented. So among the cotton farmer buddies, are you selling your cotton for higher or lower prices next season? Oh, sorry, this season, not this season, yeah. Okay, what do we think? Is it higher or lower? Oh, okay, so, I would say, okay, some higher, some lower. Okay, so in this case, it will actually increase because even though the epidemic is under control, the cotton production is already decreased and we cannot match the expected volume. So therefore, the price will increase due to higher demand. Okay, the final one, the hardest one. So prices for petroleum has been increasing since Q2, reaching historical new heights. Will your cotton prices increase or decrease? Yeah? Okay, so what do we think? Okay, mostly increase? Okay, great. So yes, you are correct, it will increase again, but because petroleum is a material used to create polyester, which is a major competitor of cotton. I bet you didn't know that. So due to the increase in polyester prices, demand for cotton also increased, resulting in higher prices. So if you got all three correct, you can consider a career in finance, perhaps an investment. But I hope that these examples show you the scale of how things are connected. Sometimes the effect of a change is evident. For example, it's obvious that rising temperature will affect the crops. But sometimes these connections are also less evident, like the petroleum, right? So I hope this demonstrates how future is this change rippling through a system. Because some changes, no matter how big or small, may get amplified by the feedback loop that they are a part of. And these feedback loops then affect the entire system, the ecosystem, and the other ecosystems around it. So, but this change of rippling through a system takes time. So this time between the change of it happening until it reaches us is the future that we can anticipate. And so now this is what I mean by saying that the future takes time. So often we have the first sign, a signal that something is changing, and this results in the first consequence. In this case, we saw that the petroleum prices were rising, and the first consequence was that, okay, so the polyester prices are also rising. this then goes into other consequences like, okay, so then the demand for cotton is also rising, therefore the cotton price is rising, but also the consequences keep going because the future doesn't stop at an arbitrary point, but it's a continuous line. But this is still an oversimplification because in reality, it probably looks more like this. The petroleum prices increase also results in more things than just the polyester prices increase, right? It also probably affects another industry. That affects more products, that affects more supply chains and more things down the line. So this is why that when I see people talk about the future, they often take a very pessimistic outlook and they immediately jump to, okay, we're gonna live in the matrix, the robots are gonna take over, we're gonna become batteries. And the reason that I find it kind of endearing is because that you have jumped many steps to reach that conclusion. And that is just one of the many hundreds and thousands of possible scenarios out there. So it's really curious that we tend to fixate ourselves on the most negative one, when in reality, a lot of them are equally as likely. So how this looks like and how we can harness this power is by using this tool called Future Wheel. So the Future Wheel is really a way for you to organize the thinking and questioning about the future, kind of like a structured brainstorm. This is defined by the creator, Glenn. And so an example of this is the autonomous vehicle. So the signal or sign of change they saw in the middle is that autonomous vehicle is now going to be a thing. So the first series of consequences they have are things like regulation liabilities, data sharing, automated flights. And from there, they have the second consequence, right? Some of these impact each other. That this probably means we have remote support systems, and we have tighter cybersecurities, and we have more controlled environments. But this is like too neatly in a perfect circle, so I'm suspicious. Because in reality, when you use this, it looks something more like this. And you can use this to apply to changes big or small. So big things like an automated vehicle, but also small things like a 20% budget cut, right? So the Future Wheel is a tool to help you visualize the direct and indirect impacts of change. So for example, you can see that if we had a 20% budget cut, then the first thing that it will affect is that we can't take on any new staff and we'll have no more external trainings. That will then affect, for example, we can't recruit new people or that we have less learned skills. And that will result then in increased workload and also low productivity. So from here, you can already flag some potential problems that you might encounter. So you can start preparing for this increased workload and low productivity before the cut happens. And you can make your own contingency plans to navigate the space. A more detailed example of this is that during the pandemic, a lot of futurists got together to think about what is the impact the pandemic will have on the world. So here we see also they have the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, many different consequences out there. And they also divided this circle into 6 different categories. We have the customs, social, technological, environmental, economic, and political to see where these impact might happen. And after they've mapped, so they did research to see last time some similar things happened, what was the things that were affected. And then from there, they are able to flag, okay, what are the areas of risk and what are the areas of opportunity? So for example, they saw that on the left-hand side that we will have digital bureaucracies and it becomes more mainstreams. And that was true, right? During the pandemic, when everything was forced online, suddenly you realize, oh, so you could have done this online a long time ago. You just liked it to torture me. So we did see a lot of these opportunities and risk spaces open up. So this is how you can prepare for the impact that it will have on the ecosystem. And you'll realize that when I showed you the Futurist Wheel, I said that the researchers looked at last time when something like this happened and what were the actions that they took place. And this is a common theme among futurists, that we say that in order to look forward, you have to look back at least twice as long. So let's look back at what we can learn from the past. When we say that everything is connected, what is the future connected to? The most obvious one is time. But the way that we think about time now, whether it's on our watch, on our calendars, is actually quite a capitalist concept pushed by Henry Ford and other capitalists as a way to maximize our productivity and to measure our efficiency. So if you wanted to know what was time like before, an Aboriginal person would tell you that time is like a pond that you can swim through, up, down, around. And indeed, we see many indigenous cultures around the world preserve a much deeper connection to time. And to them, time is connected to the tide, to the season, to the ripening of fruits. So as a result, time becomes a natural, tangible element in the systems around them, and the future also becomes a natural extension of the present. This is how the Vanuatu people are able to tell upcoming cyclones based on the mango tree's early flowering, or the Khasi people of India spending decades weaving bridges out of tree roots, not for themselves, but for the generations to come. Or a few years ago, during an awful Australian fire, some forests remain untouched because the local indigenous people practice ritualistic controlled cool burnings exactly to prevent future fire, but also to kickstart the germination process. So here we see that indigenous people have been practicing short-term, long-term futuring, system thinking, circularity, long before we even had the name for these concepts. And I will argue that this is because they preserve their connection to time, and so by extension, the future also becomes a natural part of their everyday life. A few years ago, the BBC wrote an article that said short-termism is the civilization's greatest threat. But I'm an optimist, and I tend to think that short-termism is a relatively new concept, and that we saw from the indigenous ways people of living and preserving the world around us, that there's hope for us to change the way that we view time and to cancel out this temporal dissonance that we have of disconnecting time with the future and thereby disconnecting our present with the future afterwards. And so here, this is the final truth I want to leave you with, is that the future is rooted. The future is never some arbitrary concept floating vaguely in the distance, but instead the future extends its roots to us in the present. You can find every scenario of the future, you can trace it back to a change happening right now. And so the future is always being rooted in our experience of time, is rooted in our actions of the present, is rooted in the living systems around us, and is rooted in this earth. Okay, so let's do a quick recap. When we looked at storytelling, we said that the future is not bloodless, it is not lacking emotional warmth, but instead is always colored with our hopes and dreams and emotions. When we look at speculative design, we learned that the future is selfless. It is not only about us, but it's about all of the species that deserves the future equally. Finally, from system thinking, we saw that the future has roots. It is not an isolated floating concept in the distance, but rather it is rooted in the actions that we take today. And in all of this, we talked about how things could be different, and now I want to leave you with an antidote. So this is the Bezos man, and sometimes it's hard for us to find empathy for the world's biggest capitalist. But one day I was reading an interview that he had, where a journalist asked him, "Mr. Bezos, what do you think will be different in the next 10 years? And Jeff Bezos looked down and he thought about it, and he said, "I very frequently get the question, what's going to change in the next 10 years? That is a very interesting question. It's a very common one. I almost never get the question, what's not going to change in the next 10 years? And indeed, if you're creating things or building a business, it makes much more sense to base on the things that won't change rather than the things that will. And I will argue that the thing that doesn't change throughout time is our needs. As humans, we will always have the same needs to be loved, to dance to music, to eat our favorite food. And what changes is the technology around it of how we meet these needs. Henry Ford is most famous for saying that if I asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. But I will argue that he asked the wrong question. If he asked them, what do you need? They would have said, we need to travel faster. And that need would still stay the same today. And what changed is all of the technologies and ways we have to meet these needs. And so really creating for the future has always been a fine balance of knowing what are the things that will not change in a world where everything could be different. It is knowing that what is and what could be. And I often get asked a question like, what is the business value of thinking about the future? If you have to put a number to it, why should we invest in your trainings or workshops to learn more about the future? And I would tell you that thinking about the future is like going to the gym. It's like exercising the muscle in your brain that help you discern what is the thing that won't change and what are the things that will. And what would the things that won't change look like in a world where everything could be different? And so when the day comes when you really have to make a decision about the future, you already have the mental flexibility and the practical skepticism and the hard empathy required to make these choices. And okay, now the final takeaway. I know I'm running out of time. I'm going to speed up the speed that I talk. In the past, when I talk about this topic, in the end, I said that what we need the most when we design or create for the future is empathy. That first, we need to learn how to extend empathy beyond ourselves to listen to other people's stories and visions about the future. Then we need to extend empathy beyond our own species to find a voice for those without. And finally, lastly, we need to extend empathy beyond our own temporalities, to realize that we're designing for systems that existed long before us and will continue to exist without us. But that was a few years ago, and so much has happened in the last 2-3 years. My view on this is starting to change. So now I would say that what we need most when we create for the future is urgent optimism. Not even regular optimism, but urgent optimism. And optimism isn't just blind happiness, but it is the belief that your desired outcome will come true. And to believe in that takes a lot of courage in this world where there's a lot of instabilities and endless doom scrolling. So how do you become more optimistic? And surely it's not like American cycles where you hype yourself up in the mirror every morning like, today's going to be the day, I'm going to be happy. So that was also part of my research that I wanted to know. In the beginning, I asked you 2 questions. How optimistic do you feel in the next 10 years? And how powerful do you feel in shaping the next 10 years? These are the same questions I asked my students before a course. And before the course started, they answered 47%. And honestly, not very high, considering that they are the literal future generation. But at the end of the 6-month course, I asked them the same question again. And now we see that it's 66 and 64. It's not as high as I hope it to be, but it's almost a 50% increase. So what happened during that 6 months? What did we do that made them become much more optimistic about the future? So if you're lacking in optimism, I have some good news for you. And that is that optimism is a skill. It can be learned. It comes from thinking, playing, learning about the future. What we did in that 6 months is exactly what we did today. We talked about the future, we debated, we thought about it, we've done thought experiments, and we designed for it. And so in this process, we learned how to build empathy for our own future and our collective future at large. I used to be a person that was really afraid of the news because I thought there was really no point to think about the future when it's kind of decided for me. So why should I spend my energy creating things that will not come true or things that I cannot control? But the irony is that by doing exactly those things that we can democratize the future, and you take back some of the empowerment that you were missing, and you realize that your actions today your actions in the past have an effect on the present, just as your actions in the present has an effect on the future. And so with this newfound optimism, I found the things that once terrified me suddenly comforts me. Because I can say that, yeah, the future is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But that is exactly why the future is what we make it to be. So thank you so much for your time, and hope to see you in the future.